The moon! Just like our own, this astronomical body flares with the sun's reflected light, illuminating the night sky, revolving around the Earth from west to east in about 27.5 days, and in most years, completing 13 orbits total. Just a minor constituent in the vastness of the story. This natural satellite overlooks the events of Sonic's world with a brisk haze and gentle glare. But hang on, isn't it meant to be in half? How is it still intact? I am the Sega Scourge, the Sonic Theorist, tackling 27 years of classic and modern Sonic alike. Let's find out.
Sonic Theorist.
Plus, all I really want is just to help people, you know?
You got that wrong. You blew up the moon.
Only half of it. And look, you can't even see the missing half anymore.
There are reasons for that. Maybe someday we'll get to tell those stories.
The moon in Sonic has become notorious to the fanbase, almost as much as the never-ending Sonic breathing in space argument that I covered a while back. Huge inconsistencies with the moon's appearance have left the community divided on explanations as to why this could be. This spans from back in 2001 to 2005 and the games released in that time frame. Rather than ramble on, let's look back at where this whole saga started. Little Theorist, time to wake up.
Firmware update complete. How may I help, Sega Scourge?
Wow, you're looking snazzy, LT. I like the new style.
Error. I am not programmed to receive compliments.
Hey, that makes two of us, pal.
Negative. I lack the necessary function to respond to flattery. You, on the other hand, simply lack self-esteem.
Firmware updates can be deleted, you know.
Idle conversation aside, please allow me to outline the basis for this theory. Back during Sonic the Hedgehog's 10th anniversary, the release of Sonic Adventure 2 saw a plot device in which Dr. Eggman, as a show of force to the world, utilized the power of the space colony Ark and used the Eclipse cannon to decimate half of the moon, right before the eyes of the Earth's residents.
It was certainly a spectacle. We all remember this iconic scene playing out. With 1,737.5 kilometers of mass, close to 1,080 miles of the moon's body missing, I won't go into the disastrous implications such an event would have on the Earth's tides. I think that's been made painfully obvious by everyone online at this point. But the fact remains, the moon was in a permanently disfigured state after the events of Adventure 2. But oddly, in the games following SA2, particularly noted in Shadow the Hedgehog, it's as if this event never took place at all.
What the fuck?
The moon is back to its fullest, with no sign of any missing half. Continuity be damned, right?
This erratic change of the moon's state has baffled the Sonic community for years upon years, with Takeshi Iizuka, head of Sonic Team, finally sharing his thoughts on the subject in an interview with Gamer Informer as of June last year.
That's right. Here's what he had to say. As we see the moon as it's presented in Sonic games now, we see one side and it looks very nice and presentable. However, maybe the dark side of the moon is how everyone remembers it to be. Not much else is clarified, sadly. Now, as much as I respect the word of Iizuka-san and usually take everything he says as gospel, well, look at the FMV from Sonic Adventure 2. Paying close attention to the shots following the moon's demolition. From the viewpoint of bystanders on Earth, a literal half-moon can clearly be seen, complete with fragments and molten residue. That would insinuate, based on real-world perspective, that half the face of the moon would have exploded. However, Izuka-san's statement actually implies that the moon has turned, that it has since changed its facing position, and the dark side of the moon, the side we cannot visibly see, is the missing half. And while that sounds like a conceivable explanation to this issue, many people in the community have been quick to note the flaws in this statement, sending the credibility of his claim into question. And here's why. You see, the moon maintains a synchronous rotation with the Earth. The moon's gravity slightly tugs at our planet and gives us our tides. Equally, Earth pulls at the moon. And due to the Earth's pull, the moon rotates on its own axis at approximately the same speed that it orbits our planet. The moon is gravitationally locked to the Earth. As a result, observers from Earth always view the same side of the moon as it moves across the night sky. The moon does not rotate. We always see the same side facing us.
However, that creates a contradiction. As Mr. Izuka is suggesting, the moon is not only rotated, but rotated around 22.2 kilometers an hour across a quarter of its own axis, at some unspecified point in time, and for reasons unknown.
Precisely. This would mean that SA2's moon, the moon we later see in Shadow the Hedgehog, has broken away from Earth's gravitational influence, relocating to its new facing position. Now, for this next segment, I present the term escape velocity, the minimum velocity which a celestial body must possess in order to escape the gravitational attraction of a particular planet or other gravitating mass. So in short, the speed something must be traveling in order to break away from the gravity of something else.
The moon's mass is 7.4 times 10 to the power of 22.2 kilograms. In other words, that's roughly 73.5 quintillion metric tons.
Not to mention the moon's orbital velocity of 3,700 kilometers per hour. That's reasonably fast. An equivalent for us would be an XB-70 Valkyrie, one of the top 10 fastest jets in the world. Capable of speeds up to but not exceeding 3,704.4 kilometers per hour. Earth's escape velocity, however, is 40,320 kilometers per hour. So regardless of all that, you're talking about a lot of energy to accelerate the moon to escape velocity. Now, I'm not here to debunk or invalidate Izuka-san's explanation by any means, but what I am going to do is present my own interpretation with my own reasoning, independent from Izuka-san's, and leave it up to you guys to decide which explanation you prefer. But that will be later in this video. Before I do that, I think it's only fair that I delve a little more into substantiating Izuka's claim of what happened to the moon in the games following SA2. Validating Izuka-san's statement is some tricky business. Before we continue, I'd like to clarify that I'll be primarily sourcing most of my information from the games Sonic Adventure 2 and Shadow the Hedgehog, as I feel that they are the two entries to the story that relate most to this whole moon fiasco. It's beyond argument that SA2 and Shadow have a branching storyline. Shadow follows up from SA2 directly, without a doubt. I say that's a fair statement, right? Therefore, I'll be using them as reference for this video. Anyway, sorry for that tangent. Back to discussing Izuka's dark side of the moon theory. As I said, the moon turning on its own axis isn't an ordinary occurrence. In order for this to be true, the moon would have to be separated from Earth's gravity by reaching escape velocity.
The problem with changing the velocity of the moon in either direction is that the energy required would be proportional to the mass and the square of the velocity. Thus, for an object as large as the moon, even small changes in velocity require huge amounts of energy. Escape velocity, however, is the same regardless of which direction you go. So no matter the bearing, you'd still need to increase the orbital velocity of the moon by about 36,620 kilometers per hour for it to fly away.
So the question isn't so much how the moon rotated, but more so, what could cause the moon to accelerate to a speed in which it would leave its gravitational restraints and then rotate? And I think a potential answer to that lies not in the games following, but more in the events of what we see during the moon's fracture in SA2. What we need to demonstrate the plausibility of Izuka's statement is one thing: sheer blunt force trauma. Horsepower. Something that, with enough kick, with enough impact velocity, could push the moon out of orbit. And of course, we know only one thing struck the moon in Sonic Adventure 2. The Eclipse Cannon's laser. The Eclipse Cannon is undoubtedly a ridiculously powerful superweapon, capable of decimating stars and other small planetoids. But if we were to hold the cannon accountable for the moon's hypothetical change in rotation, how much energy would the cannon have to be dishing out to trigger such an action? Well, to answer that, first we need to establish the binding energy of the moon. Definition please, LT.
Binding energy. Definition. Binding energy, also known as separation energy, is the energy required to decimate a whole system into separate individual parts.
Whenever a system forms a bound state, it requires some kind of energy to initiate the reaction. Like, for instance, striking a match against a frictional surface. That system then releases energy, thermal energy through combustion or kinetic energy from motion. What this means is if the bound system is then supplied the same amount of energy again, the binding energy, the system will then break up into its original elements. So if the binding energy can be matched, the object in question would break down. In the case of the moon, this would be known as gravitational binding energy. This is the minimum energy it takes to disconnect two objects that are bound to each other by gravity, ceasing the gravitational influence. After all, remember, we're considering what it would take to separate the moon from its orbit, causing it to turn.
The binding energy of our moon is a compact 1.2 times 10 to the power of 29 joules, or rather, 120 octillion joules.
That amount of energy in of itself is equivalent to around 1 trillion hydrogen bombs, some 50 quintillion megatons.
Estimating. To shift the moon's position, the Eclipse Cannon would first need to provide at least 124 octillion joules of energy to exceed the forces which hold the moon in place and send the moon out of orbit.
This provides just enough potential on the energy to blow up the moon, while also enough to propel the moon to over 40,000 kilometers per hour, thus moving it out of its natural rotation. There are two problems with this assumption, however. Two things holding it back from being a perfect explanation. One, the result of such an immediate force of energy would be close to instantaneous. What I mean is, in SA2's FMV, we would have seen the moon begin to move right after being struck. And more importantly, two, realistically, if the moon left Earth's gravitational orbit, it would inevitably spin out of control and potentially drift into the Earth, the collision of which would cause catastrophic damage. Not to mention, the fragments of the detonated moon would enter Earth's atmosphere and rain down planet-wide destruction. Now, of course, as I'm sure many people in the comments will note, this is a video game, so some allowances can be made in certain areas. But in the realms of realism, it's very 50-50.
Correct. The moon could either drift off into space or slingshot around and collide with our planet. The chances of it remaining stationary or resuming its original orbital rotation are very slim, and somewhat ludicrous.
But that's the only possibility I can draw from Izuka-san's information, so whether or not you choose to believe it is entirely up to you. With that amount of energy, the Eclipse Cannon could unfasten the moon from its natural orbit, but what would happen after that is anyone's guess. But, as I mentioned before, there's still the matter of my own theory to address. One more explanation for that ever-bothersome lunar object. So, set Mr. Izuka's statement aside for a second, remove it from your mind, and consider this instead. Consider that the moon in Sonic as we know it now was never blown in half at all. Before we go on, I'd like to make it known, a viewer of mine, a gentleman by the name of Yarcaz, got in touch with me on Twitter a while back and helped me bring this whole theory to life. Here's a few words from him. LT, would you?
Of course. Loading file. Message reads,
Hey guys, I'm Yarcaz. You probably haven't heard of me, as I'm just a basic Sonic fan that has been all over the place. I've had many theories about the Sonic franchise for quite a while, whether they be big or small, but I never could find a way to be quite professional enough to make a video or explanation on the theories of mine that would be satisfactory in my opinion for an audience. But then, earlier this year, I came to the Sega Scourge to bring to his attention a theory of mine that I had been developing since around the fall of last year, and this was the only big personal theory of mine so far that had seemed to be the most likely of being possibly correct, and I was worried about sharing it because I wasn't that well known, besides a few people in the Sonic community here and there knowing about me. So I had doubted that a video made by me on this theory would get enough attention to reach enough people's ears within the Sonic community. But luckily enough, the Sega Scourge here was kind enough to hear me out. A random fan of his Sonic theories on his YouTube channel. Not only did he hear me out, but he liked my idea so much that he decided to make a Sonic theory video on it in the future whilst crediting me, which is this video. So, we worked from there together to collaborate, refine, and advance this theory in order to get to what it is now.
Hey, no problem, dude. I was happy to take on this theory. It's very illuminating, and I've thoroughly enjoyed working on it with you. I'm really glad you brought it to my attention.
Well, nevertheless, thank you so much for deciding to take this theory head on. And now, take it away, Sega Scourge!
Our theory goes like this. It's our belief, mine and Yarcaz's, that the missing half of the moon was repaired, possibly during the events of SA2. And no, this isn't some Dr. Eggman rebuilt the moon like in Sonic X baloney. No, instead, after extensive research and brainstorming, we came to the conclusion that the moon could have possibly been fixed using the power of chaos control.
Chaos control. Properties and uses. Known to suspend and transport matter. Beyond suspending matter, chaos control is also known to have some control over the time flow of objects and users of the act, as well as the space around them. But how could this ability factor as a variable solution to this moon dilemma?
I'm glad you asked, LT. Allow me to take the reins for the rest of this one. Bear with me here as I will try to clarify the relevance behind all this. As for how Chaos Control could refashion the moon's crust, well, as you know, the two most prominent MacGuffin items in the Sonic universe spanning back to the classic Sonic era are the sets of mystical gems, the Time Stones, and the Chaos Emeralds. While the Time Stones can alter time on a broader scale, rewinding and fast-forwarding history around the user, the act of Chaos Control can only manipulate time in isolated areas, such as suspending matter or slowing time around the user in a way that they want, and there has to be a distance limit to this. In many ways, Chaos Control forms a dense field of energy around the user, warping the momentum of time in only that condensed area. It's a bubble of sorts. Evident in SA2 when the act is performed by Shadow for the first time, and during the transportation of the Ark in the game's post-final boss cutscene. I think some of you might know where I'm going with this. With enough energy at one's disposal, primarily this fictional chaos energy, one could seemingly reverse time on an object or mass, and restore it to a previous state by manipulating the object to a place in time that they once were. So you are either reversing time in an isolated area on an object, or moving the object back to their original formation and whatever arrangement or place you want the object to be in. As for proof on this, well, funnily enough, they show it happening in SA2 right before our very eyes without many of us even noticing it. Let's take another look at the cutscene that plays right after the defeat of the final hazard, as the space colony Ark careens towards the Earth's surface.
これ以上行かせるか。
お願い、シャドウ。
マリオ。
みんなの願いを叶えてあげて。
今だ、シャドウ。カオスコントロール。
We've all seen this cutscene 5 dozen times, I know, but while Sonic and Shadow approach the Ark in their super forms, this is where you'll find the instance of this object restoration idea being demonstrated. Pay close attention to this part. Just before and then during the Chaos Control performed by the Super Hedgehog duo, the Space Colony Ark's descent through the atmosphere causes a couple of the more fragile components of the Ark to dislodge. More accurately, these protruding wedge-shaped panels dotted around the rim of the space station's underside. The immense G's caused by the Ark's atmospheric entry rip off these fin-like antennas and send them whirling off behind the colony somewhere. Now, this is the cool part. After Chaos Control is performed, and when we see the Space Colony arc reappear for the rest of SA2's closing, we see that the missing panels are mysteriously reattached as if they never snapped off in the first place. To add to this, 2005's Shadow the Hedgehog shows that they are still indeed intact, so not only was the Space Colony arc moved back to its original orbiting position along with having no downward velocity, but it was also restored to how it was before it started falling. But that's not all. Remember how Sonic supposedly disabled the Ark's cannon so that it couldn't be used to fire upon the planet in SA2? Well, it's shown as fully operational in Shadow. So not only was the Ark somehow fixed externally, but it was also apparently repaired on the inside, as evidenced by this now fully functional Eclipse cannon. The reason for this? The Chaos Control technique performed by Shadow and Sonic restored the Ark to its previous position and state in time, before the cannon and outer panels were broken. And yes, it's mine and Yarcaz's belief that the same thing happened to the moon. That during the final battle in SA2, Sonic or Shadow, more likely Shadow, either executed Chaos Control in the vicinity of the moon, invoked the technique near the Ark and then the ability ricocheted, or the residual discharge from the Ark's disappearance rippled across space and washed over the moon in its wake. After all, it doesn't seem like a stretch, since if the Space Colony Ark could be restored to its previous condition, what's to say Shadow couldn't restore the moon to its precursory shape as well? And the reason I say Shadow is because, well, we know that Shadow overall has better control over chaos energy, and I don't think that Sonic was as well versed in chaos control at that point, as he'd only just grasped how to harness chaos control in the last few hours. So for Shadow, moving the Space Colony Ark and the moon, whether it be deliberate or not, whilst in super form, would be a realizable feat, as he possesses the power of all 7 Chaos Emeralds at once. But if this was true, you ask, then why did Shadow fall to Earth? Well, it's likely that he simply wasn't as versed in super transformation as Sonic was. On top of using double the required energy to restore the Ark and the moon, this extreme undertaking probably left him in a severely weakened state, exhausting him, explaining his plummeting to the globe below, and in many ways, giving more meaning to his supposed death and rebirth, as he would have redeemed himself even more so than we originally thought. However, just like with Izuka-san's concept prior to this, there are inconsistencies with this explanation. The one major drawback with any of this is that we never see any of it happen. As you might imagine, that heavily shackles the theory, and being an individual that bases my case around evidence, that bugs me to no end.
Note: it's worth mentioning that in tellings of any form of media that utilize a pre-existing story, the writers often find different ways of representing it. This can lead to alterations, writing errors, and in some scenarios, entire plot pieces being changed. Or, in some more positive cases, further elaboration upon. The story of Sonic Adventure 2 in-game compared to the Sonic X anime, for instance, shows the writers had to work with the basic storyline from the game, but could then play it out as much as they wanted to, as long as certain integral mediums were followed.
That's true. And Sonic Adventure 2 the game, however, was much more limited by what the writers were allowed to inject into an 8 to 10 hour game storyline in between the actual gameplay, and this may have resulted in many drafted ideas being left behind. Take, for instance, the closing scenes of SA2. After Sonic returns to the space colony, he was in possession of one of Shadow's inhibitor rings, to present to the cast as evidence to his demise. Now, even though we didn't visually see Shadow take either of his inhibitor rings off, and from what I'm aware, he fell to Earth in the scene prior with both rings still firmly fastened to his wrists, we can still assume that this is what took place, despite us never seeing it. More to the point, we actually saw Shadow do this in Sonic X. So maybe it was implied that he did in the game too, but this detail was simply overlooked during the game's development. It is a game, and sometimes things are forgotten but implied. And that's our logic for this moon theory, but that's the state of the theory as it stands. I leave the settlement of this entirely in the hands of you guys. It's completely up to you which theory you prefer. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The moon may have caused many a headache for the fandom's grasp of continuity, but it gave rise to one of the most stellar events in the Sonic storyline to date, in one of the most memorable games of the last 2 decades. So, that's it for this video, and I think that this is a really interesting conclusion for...
I detect a lot of strain in your voice, Scourge. Are you perhaps struggling to find the correct wording to end this theory?
No, I've got it. That's one small step for man and one giant leap for hedgehog kind?
Always a pleasure to see you try your best. May I suggest a laugh track to emphasize your use of humor?
One of these days, LT, one of these days. Bang, zoom, straight to the moon. Just before we head to the outro and close the video, here's just a few short words from the awesome dude that dedicated time to help me edit this video, Harry VG. A full list of credits will be available in the description, but for now, here's Harry.
Hello, and thank you for watching that video. If you don't know who I am, or you don't read the text, I'm Harry VG, a video game reviewer on YouTube that also does anime reviews on my second channel dubbed Harry VG Extra. Pretty lazy, I know. Anyway, this video was a collaborative effort between myself and Scourge, and therefore you'll be seeing this on your screens right now. I would like to thank Scourge himself for letting me have the opportunity to edit chunks of this video for him. It was truly a blast. Anyway, if you would like to see both of us in another video, I did coincidentally upload my own video featuring the man himself about the future of Sonic the Hedgehog, as we share our own opinions on what the Big S should do next. You can find that video by checking the video out via a link in the description or as an end card of this video. Once again, we thank you for watching and take care.